Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for the organizers of our event. Amazing job. Thank you for the hospitality as well. And I'm going to start my presentation by something shared between Islamic traditionalists or traditionalism and Western feminists. I wonder if you can guess. And I know it sounds like a beginning of a bad joke, but believe it or not, regardless of the mistrust, regardless of the mutual enmity and mutual misunderstandings and even mutual accusations between Western feminism and Islamic traditionalism, they both share one thing. Unfortunately, they both share thinking of women indoor labor as no labor. And I mean by that, they think of women's domestic labor as labor with no financial value. And I'm going to explain in my paper. It's based on my book, but I'm going to try to summarize what I have there. Now, most Muslim traditionalists insist on a gender division of labor that prioritizes indoor labor as women's God-given responsibility. Women who stay at home and don't pursue careers unless forced by economic hardship, and I can't stress enough this point because it's not prohibited, it's not haram to work, but you need to be forced by economic hardship. You don't have a male provider. This is the only reason to work. No, now those women are often praised and glorified as fulfilling God's plan on earth. However, this acknowledgement and idealization of women's indoor labor does not include treating that labor as a payable work or job. I mean a work that women need to be compensated for. On the other hand, most Western feminists insist that gender justice is to be sought by providing women more opportunities to participate in paid employment, which is true. However, this view, like the Islamic traditional view, fails in treating indoor labor as a payable job. Ironically, negating the value of women's work at home and treating it as a free labor is a unique issue, as I mentioned, about which Western feminists and Islamic traditionalists seem to agree on, as both maintain that this domestic labor does not count. The Qur'an seems to have another view, a view that makes a clear distinction between the concept of mahr or sidaq, which is a one-time premarital gift that predates any marital obligations and duties, and the concept of ajr, which is a continuous marital payment for what women provide indoors. Now, before I provide my argument for this lost marital compensation, and I mean by that the compensation of ajr, or what is referred to in the Quran as ajr, I have to clarify that my argument is not an endorsement of any gender division of labor. It's only an acknowledgement of the unaddressed reality of many women who receive nothing but conflicting messages that prioritize their roles as wives and mothers and then deny them any independent financial security. At the end of the day, women, just like men, are equal partners. They have the same assigned responsibility as God's own Khalifa or God's vicegerent on earth. Education, careers, and full economic, political, and legal participation are few ways to participate their divinely assigned duty, as deputies on earth. Indoor labor is not, cannot, and should not be viewed and prioritized as a way of life unless forced by a domestic hardship. As you can see, I'm flipping the coin. So women can stay at home only if forced by a domestic hardship, and instead of the argument that they can work only if forced by economic hardship. Economic independence is a key aspect of women's liberation. Whether working at home or outside, women have the right to be financially secure. I argue for that in my book, which came 2021 in paperback, Decoding the Egalitarianism of the Qur'an. Since this is a small group, I'll be honored if you take a look and maybe provide me feedback. You can pass it after you're done. In my book, I argue that women's work in the home which has been universally and historically unrecognized as paid work, is acknowledged in the Quran as a work that should be compensated for. As I explain in this paper, the lost pre-modern Qur'anic right of Ajr, which is missing from modern Islamic state law, has been unjustly confused with Sidaq. This confusion has no textual justification. Unlike Islamic legal tradition, the Quran clearly defines Sidaq and distinguishes it from Ajr. While the Quran defines the first as a one-time gift paid to the bride before marriage and before she takes any responsibilities, Ajr is a continuous financial compensation that a woman receives during her marital life for domestic labor and other physical tasks. The distinction between Ajr and Sidaq was completely eliminated by traditional and even modern exegetes, who treat both words in the Quran loosely as if they're interchangeable and referring to the same thing. Ironically, Islamic legal interpretation grant financial rights to women outside marriage, either before or after, but deny them these rights while married. Now, today, the main source of the rejection of this argument, and I mean by that the argument for Ajr, might spring from its unconventionality. Reevaluating women's domestic labor and compensating women for that is unheard of. However, if compensating women financially for domestic work seems like an extreme act, perhaps we have to consider why we insist that women's unpaid domestic labor makes sense. Women's domestic labor does not secure women any real economic independence. However, this is the reality of many women who are under pressure end up choosing to give up their education or their professional careers. While I don't recommend it or defend it as an ideal status, turning a blind eye to it does not speak to the lived reality of millions of Muslim women around the globe. Domestic work represents a lifetime commitment that cannot simply be neglected. This domestic work should be recognized, especially in extraordinary cases. For example, families of disabled children or those with special needs. While it's far from the ideal situation, women may choose to prioritize their domestic responsibilities and should be compensated for that. So what is the Quran vision for women indoor labor? In the history of domestic development, economic development, women's domestic work has never been considered real work, that is, work worthy of financial compensation. Therefore, it's difficult today to calculate all the details. I have to acknowledge this theory is highly under-theorized. I have to admit many questions on how to pay women and how to evaluate their work are pending. Even questions on who should pay, the community, the government, or men themselves require answering as well. However, what matters is the acknowledgement of indoor ajr as right for women in marriage. The references in the Quran are many, and for the limited time I have, I'm gonna share only samples. For example, in 4:4, we read, وَآتُوا النِّسَاءَ صَدُقَاتِهِنَّ نُحْلًا, give women their bridal gift upon marriage. The linguistic root sadaqa that links sidaq to sadaqa, which refers to charity, is further confirmation the sidaq is a gift. Unlike sidaq, the Quranic text uses the word ajr to refer to compensation either for good deeds in the afterlife or the worldly life. Sometimes it refers to compensation or salary in exchange for hired work. Ajr then always makes a reference to compensation and is not granted freely in the Quran. Therefore, when the same word ajr is used in marital context, it must refer to a situation in which compensation is given for some form of work. In other words, it must refer to the Quranic acknowledgement of women's domestic work, like cleaning, cooking, serving, and other related responsibilities like giving birth, nursing, and child rearing. In another example, In 424 we read فَمَا اسْتَمْتَعْتُمْ بِهِ مِنْهُنَّ فَآتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ فَرِيضَةً. So far, whatever you enjoy in marriage from them, give them their due marriage compensation, ujur or ujurahunna, as an obligation. In the Quran, ajr comes as a compensation then, a compensation that is required for the marriage to be sound. Unfortunately, this understanding of the verses has been lost in the traditional exegetical assessments, which interpret ajr in 424 as a reference to sidaq or the premarital gift, and interpret ajr in 665:6 as a reference to the payment after divorce. Both verses grant financial rights to women outside marriage, either before or after, and deny them, and I mean in interpretation, not the verses themselves, and deny women their rights while married. In contrast to this misleading or wrong or misled interpretation, I argue that ajr refers to a financial right within marriage that is one that is spent that is separate from sidaq, as sidaq is prior to marriage. Based on my understanding of the Quran, it's simply not true that Muslim women or Muslim women's God-given responsibility is to stay at home and not engage in an independent career. If forced to do that, I argue they deserve a compensation. And therefore, the Quran makes it an obligation for women to financially compensate their wives when they choose that path, which I don't take as the prioritized one in the Quran. I'm ending here. In contrast to the culturally constructed concepts, the Quran clearly states that women are not created from men, not created after men, and even more importantly, they are not created for men, nor assigned a sacred duty to serve men. And thank you for your patience.